Hello and welcome to this webinar, The Deeper Shift, Culture and Systems Change. I'm Charlie Leadbeater and I'm an advisor to the Rockwall Foundation here in Copenhagen, who are the hosts of this Systems Innovation Festival, which is part of our Systems Innovation Initiative. And we would, of course, love to have all of you here with us in Copenhagen. And unfortunately, we can't. So just to give you a little sense of some Danish kind of hygge, I'm going to light my candle and I'm going to put that behind me there, just to give you a sense of the kind of atmosphere we'd like to create. And I've got a Danish flag just to sort of really identify myself. So I'm going to put that in my flower pot behind me there. So this is not an individual webinar, it's part of a festival that we're holding of about 6 events over a week, where we're looking at different aspects of how to change systems. We've looked at how you change systems from the inside. We're going to look at how you invest in systems change. We're going to have a fascinating discussion at the end of the week with Sonia Nishtar from Pakistan about how she created a new welfare system almost from scratch in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So why are we interested in systems? Well, because systems are really powerful and they're all around us and we rely on them the whole time. And we rely, of course, on transport systems and electricity systems, but we also rely on education systems and health systems. And the systems that we're most interested in at the Rockwall Foundation are those social and human systems to do with social and human well-being, care, education, work, health, so on and so forth. And we think that the challenges that many of those systems face are getting more intense. Some of those systems seem stuck, or at least the problems they deal with seem stuck. There are growing challenges of aging and mental health. And we're also interested in the opportunity to create new systems. So we're interested in systems innovation, a much abused word, that systems innovation, because we're interested in how people can set out to deliberately change systems for the better. We understand quite a lot about how systems have changed. We're interested in how you can deliberately set about changing them. We're interested, as a result, in very practical knowledge. How can you do it in practice? Lots of theory about systems, lots of thinking, lots of mapping, all of that is incredibly useful, but we're interested in, well, what are the practical steps that you can take? And we're not just interested in fixing systems or fixing problems, we're interested in whether you can create new systems and better outcomes. And just to give you a flavor of the kind of frameworks that we've been playing with, that you can read about in our green paper, I'm going to switch to this overhead camera just to my side. And this is the point at which I channel my inner 1980s children's television presenter, and just show you a couple of the models that we've been working with. So one model is that we think that there are 4 keys that are often involved in systems change. The first is, what's the purpose of the system? And we think that systems rarely change without, in fundamental ways, without that purpose being put in question. Who's setting the purpose? What is it for? That almost always raises issues of power. Well, who's in charge of the system? Who sets its agenda and why? Is it based on their knowledge or their political authority or their status or their command over resources? Where does the power come from? Is it obvious power? Is it hidden power? We think that systems are made up of patterns of relationships. Systems are connections between related things which produce an outcome. So we're interested in the nature of those relationships and the pattern and the framework of them. Because when systems shift, those patterns shift. And then we're also interested in how resources change through systems. So what we think is that when systems are stable, these things often fit together in a very sort of tight kind of way like this. So they're very locked together. And when systems shift, you've got to open that up. And you've got to open up the question of what the purpose is, what the power is for, and who has it. And then the system can realign into a different kind of shape. Same sorts of ingredients, but in a different sort of configuration. So we're interested in how that happens. And we're interested in the question of culture. We can leave that diagram there for a while, but we're interested in the question of culture because the cultural dimension frames our understanding of what's needed, what's possible, who should lead, so on and so forth. And we've got a great cast of speakers to help us explore that, all of whom in different ways have experience of challenging and coaxing systems to adapt and adopt different cultures and challenging dominant cultures, I suppose, within systems. Etmanski is joining us from Vancouver, Diane Roussin from Winnipeg, and Imandeep Kaur from Birmingham. And I'll come to them in a second, but first of all, I'd like to get a sense of who is in the room and perhaps a little bit of why you're here. So I'm just going to launch the first of our couple of polls we're going to do. It's very simple to answer this. I'm sure people have done these before. The first is just to find out, have you been to the conference already, the festival, or are you new? Where are you logging in from? We've had more than 1,600 people sign up for the conference from 71 countries all over the world. And a little bit about the context that you're working in. Are you working in a culture that's resistant to change or pretty open to change? And are you at ease with the systems culture or are you at odds with it? So we've got a little bit of time left to keep on voting. I can see the vote climbing. And after we've done this poll, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes explaining how you can interact with us through the course of the session and contribute your questions and get feedback and add to the discussion. So I'm just going to give it another 10 seconds to vote. So we've got 10 seconds left to vote, and then we'll close that poll. I think we're over 85%, about 85% of people have voted. So 28% are new today. So that means probably almost a little over 2/3 has already been at the festival. We've got a big contingent from Denmark and Europe, some from Africa. You're very welcome, great to see you. A contingent from North America, which would of course include Canada, and a spread of people from Central and Central America, Middle East, and Asia. A small majority think that they're working in a culture which is resistant to change, and a significant minority think they're in a culture open to change. And most people are odds with the culture that they're in. So we're here, I hope, to help you and to provide you with some practical sort of tips and guidance as to how to tackle that. My colleague Jenny Winhall is hosting the Q&A channel. Most Zoom calls, of course, you interact with chat. Actually, on the webinar, you interact with Q&A. Jenny, just tell us a little bit about how that works and what questions we've got so far.
Yes, I will do. So I'll be doing my best to make sure that the questions and comments that you are posting, we bring some of those into the conversation today. We've already had quite a few questions that people have submitted as they've been signing up for today's session or watching Diane and Al's videos. So we'll make sure that we look at those. And as Charlie says, there are two ways in which we'll be interacting. The chat button at the bottom of your screen is where we'll be communicating to you. That's where we'll be posting links, hashtags, anything that you need to use as we go through the session. And then the Q&A function is where we would like to hear from you. So just to give you an idea of how that works, let's post a question in there just now. So this question is, why does culture matter when you're trying to shift systems? And you can comment under that question to give us a few of your reflections. And then as we go through, you're very welcome to post your own questions. You can upvote people's questions and their responses so that we can see what's coming to the surface for you as we go through.
Great, Jenny, thank you very much indeed. We've also got with us, not actually with us, but on screen, a graphic recorder, Riley, who is based in Mexico City. And she will be keeping a graphic recording of the session. We'll dip into that as the session goes on. And at the end of the session, we'll come back to it. And tomorrow morning, you'll get a digital copy of Riley's drawing of the session to try and sum it up. And of course, it goes without saying, you're welcome to contribute on social media. We'll put the relevant hashtags and other information down in the chat. So without further ado, let's get on with talking to Al and Diane. It's great to have both of you here. We've had great chats before. Al, could I start with you? Could you just tell us a bit? You've had a long career, you've achieved many, many things. Tell us a bit about what your work in the field of disability rights and working with people with disabilities has involved. You've achieved things at several different levels of the system, if you like. Tell us a bit about what that has involved, and particularly perhaps the Registered Disability Savings Plan, which is one of the innovations that you were associated with.
Hi, Charlie, and it's nice to be here. Hello, everybody. Over 40 years ago, my second daughter was born with a disability. We tend not to talk too much about it because she's an artist and a spoken word poet and never paid attention to the rule book associated with Down syndrome, which is just fine with all of us. At the same time, she ushered me into, welcomed me into, benighted me into the disability movement. And I'm an old community organizer, and so I tried to apply my trade of community organizing to the disability movement. The early stages were closing all the segregated facilities, institutions, segregated schools, and the like. But then we realized that while that was a modest improvement, people were still hampered by, handicapped by society's attitudes and beliefs and values. And so the quest from there on for the past 30 years has been to find ways to ensure that people with disabilities get to show us how competent, powerful they are, and what a great contribution they have made throughout history, seldom acknowledged, and how do we make it possible for people to not only welcome people with disabilities and their power and capabilities, but ensure that they are involved in all the major challenges that affect our society, not just the ones associated with disabilities. So that's basically been my work.
Yeah. And so it starts with two big things. The first is actually working inside the system and shutting things down, stopping them, decommissioning the bad old bits of the system. And it starts with a very big idea, which is about disability, capability, living a good life, not seeing people through the lens just of their disability. What are some of the concrete things that you then tried to do? Because you did try then to, and you succeeded in bringing about significant innovation and change in the way that people with disability could live in Canada. Could you talk us through some of that change?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And your phrase "a good life" is the key phrase for us. For a lot of my life, I was trained as a social worker. I would ask people what kind of programs and services they needed, and of course they answered in program and service language. And the big breakthrough for us was to ask the question, "What's a good life?" And that's a one-size-fit-one question. And it leads to a splendid rethinking of disability. And without going into all of the elements of that, there were a couple that were really important. We came to realize that two of the biggest handicaps faced by people with disabilities are their poverty, their financial poverty, and their social isolation. Even though they might have programs and services, they were alone, isolated in those services and programs. One of the things that we then did with that reconceptualization is propose a disability savings plan. That was a 10-year process, but I'm proud to say that Canada adopted in 2008 a registered disability savings plan. There's now over $5 billion in collective assets, so that's very practical, Charlie, but it also, I think, put on the agenda the fact that poverty and disability are equated, and they shouldn't be. And so that's the stage I'm in right now, is with colleagues across the country ushering in the equivalent of a universal basic income for disabled people.
So this is let's follow that story through in due course, but I don't want to lose some other elements of it. So you create a registered disability savings plan so that families could save, so that their children with disability could have some savings to draw on when their parents died, or that is that the basic idea of the...
It is the basic idea, but it's equally important to say people with disabilities themselves. So we have the equivalent.
Into it.
We had an elected cabinet minister in British Columbia who had a disability, and she had a son with a disability. She had a registered disability savings plan for herself, and she had one for her son. So it's really open, and more importantly.
So this is a really important financial innovation, which is also a social innovation, which is a practical thing. And which unlocks and helps to address this poverty issue. How did you go about addressing the isolation issue?
This is primarily the work of my wife, Vicky Kamak, and we followed in the footsteps of many people who were beginning to understand that isolation was an issue for people with disabilities. And what she did was make it into a program that could be made into a system. And so we developed a way to organize social networks, circles of friends for people with disabilities, and to finance that independently. We did that by discarding, if you will, or not paying as much attention to the nature of the disability, and instead focusing on highlighting the passions, the interests, the hobbies, the talents, the desires of individuals, and inviting regular folks in the community to join with us in a relationship with the individual, and then watch them shine, watch them grow, watch them flourish.
Right. So thinking back to our four keys, this relational aspect is absolutely critical to finding a new purpose as well. And the purpose is living well, not serving someone with disability with a particular kind of service. What have you found in that process? This has been a long process. You've shut things down, you've innovated things, you've created new financial products, you've changed legislation, you've taken law cases. What have you found about whether that has really shifted assumptions about people with disability? Because your book, you've got this brilliant book out at the moment called The Power of Disability, which when you read it is really just a celebration of life in all of its variety and diversity, and the possibility of living well in many, many different ways. Is that because you think you've succeeded in making that shift, or because it hasn't yet gone far enough?
No, it hasn't gone far enough. Lurking deep in our institutions, in our statutes, in our legislation, and in the habits and behaviors of people in those structures are beliefs about people with disabilities that are wrong, that are false. They were false at the beginning, and they haven't gone away. And we've seen some of that surface during COVID, when in our country, people with disabilities were the last group of people to be supported. And some of that support only arrived as the second wave of COVID was hitting us. So that's an indication, in my view, not just of political priorities, but of an attitude and belief that is systemic, and frankly, without raising too many alarms, I think it goes back, those assumptions, Charlie, go back to the eugenics era, when people with disabilities were seen to be unworthy and therefore best separated from the rest of society, ostensibly for their own good, but frankly for society's good. So that has to change. I wrote the book and called it The Power of Disability because that's what I've experienced for the past 40 years. I'm just simply observing. And I know that if the history of the world was written without the contributions of people with disabilities, you would not recognize the world.
Yeah.
They just simply haven't been acknowledged.
Yeah. And the book reads like a kind of first-hand account from the front line of that experience of people changing the world. So I just want to, at this point, then bring in you, Diane. I think you've been nodding away there listening to Al. How does that story sound to you from your perspective, which is as a First Nations Indigenous social innovator based in Winnipeg? What echoes are there from Al's story that connect with your own?
Well, a lot of what Al has said resonates a lot. Unfortunately, I feel like it's the similar experience that Indigenous people have experienced and faced here in Canada in terms of not being acknowledged, systems definitely not being, systems being created but not involving us and therefore not really serving us that well. So certainly all of that is the same. But agree with Al, if you were to really delve into how Canada has prospered, we would not be here today without the contribution of Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast. So on that note, I do want to back up just a little bit, Charlie, and just say that, as part of that recognition of the Indigenous contribution to Canada and perhaps to the rest of the world even, I am Diane Roussin. I am Anishinaabe, and I am from an area that's known as Treaty 2 area, Skowhenan First Nation here in Manitoba, Canada. And right now I am physically sitting on Treaty 1 land, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dene, and the Dakota people. And it's also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And in Canada, we are really finally doing land acknowledgements to really recognize the people that were here before settlers came and how those knowledge systems, we have economic systems, health systems, health and wellness kinds of systems. We have and have had all of those systems before settlers came here. And they were built on different kinds of values and principles, I believe, than what our mainstream dominant systems are today. And so I think they served all my relations really well. And all my relations means, I was listening to David Suzuki the other day, and he was talking about ecocentric thinking versus human-centric thinking. And so, all my relations is about the trees and the animals and the water, and so humans are a part of that interconnected ecosystem. And so our values and principles, I think, recognize that, and therefore had practices that really honored that. And Al, you're talking about, because I was immediately saying, oh, Mino Bamadzuin, he's talking about Mino Bamadzuin, and in Anishinaabe,
that means the good life, does it?
It translates roughly into the good life, which is, again, like It's really about living a happy and healthy kind of a life. And again, I think that it centers certain kinds of values and principles.
But if I've got it right, and I probably haven't, central to that concept is connectedness. You can't live a good life without being connected and related. And the other is, I suppose, a different notion of wealth and kind of richness, where that comes from, which recasts all of that. So my limited experience of my interaction with Indigenous innovators in Canada is that they bring an incredibly powerful set of thoughts and insights into how systems could work, which draw on all sorts of sources. Could you just say a little bit more then about how you now at Winnipeg Boldness are trying to translate that thinking into what you might call social innovation, I suppose?
Well, and again, similar to Al's comments at the beginning, you know, their systems have been created. You talked about that power, that purpose, and all those things. I think that the systems that are in place right now here for certain in Winnipeg, but I know they exist in all of Canada and around the world, those systems really do not, in my opinion, build the capacity of Indigenous people to have health and wellness or to thrive. They really are benefiting other people, and they really keep us in this sort of downtrodden survival mode kind of place. So with the Winnipeg Boldness Project, we knew right away, this is a social lab. We know that we're going to use the tools of social innovation to try to tackle these complex challenges that society's facing. And again, I have to just mention, and I did a TED talk on this, but the concrete example, Charlie, is that 95% of the children that are in the care of the child welfare system here in Manitoba are Indigenous. And that's over 11,000 children. Wow. And well, 11,000 children in the total care, and 95% of those are Indigenous. Costs us, like, I think in 2018, it costed us $500 million to operate that system. When we look at the outcomes of that system, children that are in the care of the state, the longer they're in the care, the worse their health and wellness outcomes are when they get pushed out at the age of 18. And so all the mental health, so that story holds for almost every system. Justice system, again, conservatively speaking, 75% of those that are incarcerated are Indigenous. And when we look at the health and wellness outcomes of folks who come out of that incarceration system, it is not good. So those systems are deeply embedded. They're well-resourced. They've been around for a long time. They're not serving Indigenous people really well. So the Boldness Project is saying, we're going to center Indigenous wisdom in the problem definition, because we don't even get asked what we think the problem is. People just jump to solution finding, and people want to solve the problems for us all the time. And they don't even ask us if we think that that's the problem. So often a lot of really great things get designed for us that we're like, yeah, that's not even the problem. And so great thing you design there, but that's not even the problem. And so again, I know Al was saying this too. So we're trying to center Indigenous people and their values and their principles in the problem definition. We're trying to center them in the solution finding. And so we're designing a whole bunch of prototypes because, and this is, we'll get to this, and this is what I'm very interested in a lot of Al's work. You know, how is it that we're going to create the systems change? I think we all agree we need systems change. We agree the systems aren't working the best for some of us. And so how do we change them, which is a very complex conversation.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, when it comes to Indigenous approaches, I don't think Indigenous approaches are well known across Canada. They certainly aren't well known in the dominant systems. They certainly aren't practiced. They certainly aren't used. And so I think Indigenous ways, we call it Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, and feeling, are a very untapped potential right now. And so that's the thing we're trying to do is create examples of what those knowledge systems can and are, and how they might help those systems change into something better. Because again, in the Winnipeg experience, many of those systems are, you know, quote unquote, serving Indigenous people, and mostly they're not. And at their worst, they're harmful to us.
So, so you are, if I've got this right, drawing on Indigenous values and knowledge, both to critique the system as it stands, which is siloed, delivers services in packets, and delivers delivers, it sounds like really poor outcomes for many people. So you're using those values to critique it, but also to map out what a better system would be like. And that's highly relational. It's it's holistic. It's based in communities. It builds capability. It works with people where they're at. Is that right? And so in that case of children taken into care, how would you use Indigenous principles to reimagine a care system?
So again, this is wisdom that's been around for a super long time. And so we're just trying to sort of document it and hold it up and shine a light on it and, you know, do these little prototypes and things. But this thinking has been around for quite some time. So right now, the child welfare system, and again, this is without, you know, sort of pointing fingers at individuals or people. I think we're all very well intentioned. It's about the system and what the system produces. The child welfare system is about protecting children. That is the premise. And so, I mean, which I questioned big time about, is it really protecting children? But it's supposed to be doing that. And so the way it goes about that is to take children out of situations, put them in other situations that are deemed safe by a mainstream system. Again, I challenge the notion that it's safe. Lots of us as Indigenous people challenge, is that really protecting children? Is that really keeping our children safe? When those health and wellness outcomes are so awful at the back end, how is that safety and protection? But that system is also based on sort of this concept of just survival. Like, let's just pull them out of there. Let's just put them in this safe place just so, you know, they can at least survive. Like that whole thinking is so problematic from start to finish. When we go to our Indigenous values, principles, and places, and we've designed prototypes around this here at Boldness, we ask, okay, what do children need? And so right away, the thing is, we need to keep families together, right? When families are struggling and things are happening, and again, when you delve into the data, in our child protection system, 11,000 children in care, 75% of the time, it's neglect issues, not hardcore, you know, physical abuse or sexual abuse. Like 25% of the time, it is an actual straight up protection issue. 75% of the time, it's more poverty and neglect and things that we can deal with in a different way. So our people want to keep families together. So we want to take the resources and figure out how we might wrap supports around families so that they can deal with the stressful situations. Because again, overlying all of this is historical colonization, trauma, poverty, all the things that Al talked about. And so our systems are looking at keep families together, build capacity of families, you know, how can we get to a place of thriving, not surviving, you know, like it's just different, like get centered when we're trying to design these systems.
So you're both operating at many different levels, but very crudely, there's a sort of explicit level, money, systems, services, and there's a sort of implicit level, which is about values. And you're both, I think, highlighting that there are very deep assumptions that you're challenging, but also something really positive. I just want to move over to my overhead camera and just show you a couple of things which I've drawn beforehand, which might allow us to sort of have a conversation about it. So this is, I don't know if we can see this. Yeah, here we go. So in a way, I think that we're talking about problems and opportunities, and a lot of the discussion in mainstream systems is based on finding the problem, and if you want to find the problem, you need to analyze it, you need to understand the need, you need to focus down, and you need to deliver, and so on and so forth. And as Diane said, you know, there's this sort of very who's deciding what the problem is. And then I think both of you have actually talked a lot really about opportunity and how can you live well. And opportunity and living well is all about connection, aspiration, opening things out, creating things. But it's much easier for the system to address a sort of problem lens. And you can, I mean, I suppose you can do this and not actually engaging any kind of cultural change. To get to this, it seems to me, to this opportunity side of the equation, that's when you've got to really engage in cultural change, because you have to see the people, the place, the relationships in a different way. Does that make sense of what you guys are talking about? Does that connect? Al?
It does to me. The problem with problems is that people move to programs too soon within the existing set of assumptions and whatever. And I've always liked to use the word challenge because it made it more broad and open. But right now I'm governed by looking at challenges as really mysteries. And what that framing does for me is it brings some humility. I need a lot of that, but it brings some humility to the quest. It doesn't try to be strident and forceful. It's about engaging as opposed to manipulating and shifting. So there's a mindset there. And what it does is it opens you then to not just the opportunities that you're showing on that diagram, but I would suggest that there are far more opportunities than in that little triangle that you have the word opportunities. There are already people who are working on the mystery. There are already people who are engaged. And so it allows you, it opens it up to paying more attention because it's a mystery to what's really going on. So I find that focus helpful.
So this connection between, if you reframe it as a challenge or a mystery, can sort of open up your opportunity in a new kind of way.
Yeah.
Diane, how does that sound?
Yeah, and again, I just there's very little that Al says that I at all disagree with. I think overriding that, and Al again really hit upon something that gets my ire up. People want to jump from problem to solution so quickly and so easily. And I mean, I do too. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. But somewhere overriding all of that is the idea of I want to move from problem to opportunity feels transactional to me. And so again, it's about how we move from problem to opportunity is very much about being in relationship. And so I know around me in Winnipeg, lots of people, because there's large Indigenous population here in Winnipeg. And so people want to, non-Indigenous people want to be a part of the solution, not the problem. So they always turn to people like me and go, hey, well, how do we do it? What do we do? We want to get on with some solutions. So what should we do? And I'm like, dude, you got to slow down and you got to talk to some Indigenous people and you got to form some relationships. And whatever you're thinking in terms of your solution, I think you need to put that aside, because if it hasn't been informed by a relationship with people, if it hasn't been co-created or collaborated or all those great words, if you haven't Indigenous people, then that is just not a right approach. And I think that when we start into that relationship, it takes time to build the trust. Right? You got to recognize the mistrust that there is and the reasons for that mistrust. And I always say another great thing about trust, when the solid, deep trust is built, we can get into complexity and problem solving quick. But and also the best relationships is where the best healing happens. And so a lot of that opportunity can also be about healing, and I mean that at the highest level in terms of all of us as a planet, our systems, healing is another way to frame some of this.
So yesterday in our session, I think we came very strongly to the view that relationships were core to all of this process to enable it. So if you've got questions or comments, just do dip into the Q&A. So the second thing that I wanted to do was say, there's one way of thinking about it, that innovation is all about creating new products. And I suppose, that's, you identify a need, you create a solution. And in a way you could say registered disability savings plan was, here's a need, we'll devise a solution, we'll get it adopted. But often I think products are dead unless they kind of embody a kind of philosophy, I suppose, a set of principles and values. But you can also have sort of principles and values, and Diane's talked about the Indigenous source of many of those, which aren't alive. And so I was very struck by Diane saying that it depended on practice. And that there's this, I think in your work, there's this connection. You're creating sort of tangible, real things, but they're underpinned by principles and they're embedded in practice. And a practice has to be a daily thing, a thing that grows in community. And practice has, whilst products are often rather explicit things, registered disability saving plan, practices are often much, much more tacit. And the cultural aspects of systems change are about getting to that tacit side of the unspoken, the unrecognized, the unacknowledged, so on and so forth. So I just want to pause there, leave that little picture up. We're going to go to the our graphic recorder, I think, at this stage, and to the Q&A to lodge another question. So this is what Riley is making of our discussions down in Mexico. And we can take a moment to see that. It's a rich and complex picture that's already building up with what is a good life right at the heart of it. And I think, Jenny, you're putting another question in the Q&A, are you, at this point, to keep the Q&A going?
That's right, Charlie. So thinking about the diagram that Charlie just drew, what kinds of things do you think are important from your own experience when trying to create a culture that's actually open to those kinds of opportunities, to those kinds of shifts? We'd like to hear from you what you think that is. And any other questions that you want, you'd like us to pick up at the end of the session for Diane and Al, make sure that you start getting those in there as well.
And we're coming to the Q&A session, but before we get there, we want to introduce one new ingredient, who is the remarkable Imandeep Kaur, who's joining us from a canal boat in Ladywood in Birmingham. Imi is many things. She was one of the creators of Impact Hub in Birmingham, which grew out of a community that wanted to create it. And she's now helping to pioneer a new approach to community development, I suppose, is the way that I would paraphrase it, Imi. But basically, Imi is like a kind of one-person whirlwind who brings incredible energy and ideas to any discussion. Imi, tell us a bit about your perspective and what you've made of what you've heard so far.
Hi, Charlie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I first want to say thank you to Al and Diane, and it's the first time I've met Al, so I hope it's not the last time we talk, but to sort of really acknowledge first that actually coming across the Winnipeg Boldness Project and Diane's work and the work of other First Nations, Indigenous practitioners really helped me to start make sense of a lot of things that I think many of us in diaspora communities whose families and histories have been affected by deep extractive colonial rule and practice over our places, and we've been spending this time kind of very much unlearning and relearning that live. And I want to say, just want to do a huge acknowledgement really to Diane and your work, because the way you've given form to that beautiful dance that we have to do within the current system, wisdom, histories, unacknowledged truths, future generations, etc., really has come from a lot of your work. So I want to say thank you for that. And that's where I kind of want to start off my reflection for a couple of minutes, which, you know, Charlie started at the beginning asking the question around, are you at ease with or are you at odds with the system? And I would say, you know, our work many years ago began in some ways at odds with the system. But actually what I was reflecting on that point is I think it's the creative tension of the at odds and the at ease that helps to usher in a lot of our work, because it is both true that staying completely in opposition to something can also create a mirrored behavior that is replicated, and we know that, and we've seen that over and over again. And so I've, you know, as I've come through this work, I've really learned more and more about the delicate dance and balance it is between that creative tension that emerges when you are both within the system, which, as Diane really beautifully said, it's very, very rarely the players of the game that are deeply problematic. I mean, sometimes they are, as we know, with the current coup that is going on, but most of the time it's the conditions that the system has created that makes the game so unfair, incentivizes so many problematic behaviors, extraction, goals that are not in line with people thriving, the planet thriving, us acknowledging histories, and so that creative tension is where I think so much of the future lies. And so actually it's very rarely just lots of bad players, it's very bad incentives and systems, and some of the stuff that we talk about in our work around the dark matter with some of our partners at 00. So that really stood out to me. And I guess the part that I think is, it jumped out in when I was seeing the sort of problem and opportunity space. I definitely feel that so much of the problem, opportunity, problem, solution, language sets up artificial binaries, and it doesn't give you the nuance of what's really going on. And I think we need a language of and it can be true that these multiple things are happening at the same time. So for example, for us, I really like to talk about, it can be true that so much of what we are seeing, even our own behaviors, are a product of many, many different things. And it can be true that we need to work with the system, and it can be true that we need to be at odds with the system in order to really bring out the space of critique and tension. And it can be true that we both need to think about people and what they need now, but know that that isn't enough, and that as Indigenous thinking and much work from many different cultures around the world, including my own, really talks about future generations. It can be true that we need to design for the now and the needs of people and their immediate needs, but it can also be true that that isn't enough, that we have to be able to design long into the future. And that sometimes means having to give up something now, right? Like, it is not, in the culture that I'm from, that's not a sacrifice. It's not, the language of sacrificing something now for future generations isn't one of sacrifice in even trying to talk about it in English is very, very difficult. But when I would talk about it in Punjabi with my family or my grandparents or my grandmother, that idea isn't one of sacrifice. It's one of how generations work together. And I think so some of this problem, opportunity, and the binaries really are problematic. And I think, when you think of many of the things that have been talked about today, from acknowledging the now, the people, the challenges, the problems, the opportunities, the relationships with the land, with all our relations, as Diane talked about it, with the past, with the future, with the wisdom that came from the past, with the problems that came in the past, with the opportunities that the future allows, with how important centering the margins who have been consistently marginalized in a number of different ways is going to matter. And I think where often I want to keep bringing the and piece back, is where often that comes into real challenge with this social innovation, social systems change innovation space, is that people brashly talk about the scale of the challenge, the pace that we need to work at. Do we not know that we're now X amount of years away from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Do we not know that we have the complexity of these challenges? And people use that as the sector uses that as another binary to disempower people. Yeah, of course we know about the impacts of climate change. Our people, our nations, our cultures, our communities, our villages have been suffering from that. In my own community, farmers in Punjab have known about that, because they've been dying in their thousands by suicide due to the way that the colonial legacy of the way water moved out of Punjab and the increasing impacts of climate disruption are having. And so this idea that the sector understands the scale and pace better than anybody else, and thus we have to work in certain ways that continues to marginalize the same people, is deeply problematic. And why I want to just go back again also to what Diane and Al said, you know, about centering those margins, but what Diane said about once you do that work, once you build that trust, once you have that expansive understanding, the pace you can work at is far quicker and far more effective than any top-down, centralized, extractive system. And I'm just going to get onto my final point as well now, Charlie. And, you know, a very practical one that we've seen here in the UK is around the test and trace, right? This idea that you could have created this huge centralized billion-pound world-beating system when you had local government, local communities, local context, culture, language, understanding, different rates of infection, that could have been a more decentralized and lots of nodes working together, is a really practical example of that. So I guess what I want to say is that we need to stop holding these two things in opposition, as if communities and those most marginalized by our current systems cannot work at the speed and scale and don't understand the challenges that we face. And that we can understand what we need to deal with now whilst designing for the scale of challenge. And all of that is underpinned by things we don't see and feel as well. And we talk about that in terms of the dark matter, and we need to really embrace that in a way. I'll pause there, and you know, if you want to come back, please do.
Amy, thank you. Amy, thank you so much. So a couple of things that stood out there. One is the importance of opening up history to open up the future. The other is this non-binary and both. And then the vital importance of centering the margins and taking due account and important role of lived experience. Al, Diane first. Thoughts, responses? A lot's been said.
Again, Amy's just brilliant. So agree with everything said there. You know, when I think about the community wisdom that's surfacing in Winnipeg and what it's telling us, you know, so and even in this conversation about the either or the and or the binary, certainly we all want to get to the and, right? That's equality. But we need to really center our work right now in equity, because that's how we get to the equality. So the equity sometimes feels like a little bit of either or, right? And sort of where are we going to put our energy and what is it we're going to build and work on, because the other one is super built. And so when we're talking about these different kinds of systems that are needed, or these other kinds of systems that actually exist, but they're not embraced by the dominant system, our community wisdom is telling us, you know, and you've heard me say, think inside the circle or work inside the circle versus, I mean, there's always this think outside the box thing, but really I think systems are triangles, right? They're these bureaucratic hierarchies. And so our community wisdom is saying, we don't want standardization, we want customization, and we can do it. We can do highly customized things in systems. They want responsiveness, they want flexibility, they want adaptability, they want values-based decision-making, I think is well suited to those kinds of approaches. I think holistic thinking is well positioned to deal with complexity. And that's where I think, I mean, you know, we get then we're set up for like emergence and iteration, which can stand the test of time. We don't have to lock in today on the thing, right? We build these systems that are really embrace the idea of emergence and iteration, and we can just continuously co-create what we need to co-create now and later and down the road. So an example I'll give you is in Winnipeg Boldness Project. Again, back to the child welfare system to give you a concrete example. You know, our community said, you know, if we really want to support parents and if we really want to keep kids safe and we want to keep families together, what are some of the things we need? Well, one thing that came up right away, which all of us, I think, who are on this in this webinar today might understand, is Granny's house. Who hasn't had a grandma? Who hasn't had like, oh, let's go to Granny's house because, you know, parents are doing something over there, or caregivers they got to go shopping, or they want to go out, or I just want to go hang out at Granny's house because Granny makes me feel good. You know, like we just do different things at Granny's house. Like Granny's house is like being on holiday all the time, right? So the idea of setting up a Granny's house in our North End, you would not believe the policies and procedures that would not allow for a Granny's house. And the red tape and just, you know, because there's all these systems out there that go, oh, we're not sure about that. We don't think that's safe. It's not, it's going to violate policy is going to violate that policy. When again, all of us naturally probably know the supportive nature of a granny's house. So that's in granny's house, you drop in when you want, you know, you use it as much or as little as you want. Like again, that emergence, that customization, and families, you know, you can use it every day, all day if you need as a family, or you can use it once a month if that's what you need as a family. So that customization is there. So again, I think there's so many examples of how we can design our,
Diane, let me bring in Al before we go to our questions that have been coming up in the channel. So Al, in your work, how have you navigated this relationship between challenging the system, surfacing its assumptions, and coaxing it to change, and not being seen just as a sort of complaining outsider? And in your, interestingly, in Imi and Diane's remarks, I think Imi was talking about creating incentives for change. What, in your experience, is the most effective way to get people to change? Is it incentives, norms, instructions, inspiration, moral suasion? What is it that gets people who are sort of, I'm not really sure about this, to think, oh, actually, this is a good idea?
Well, Charlie, I know you wanted me to be concrete and specific, and so I'm going to try to be, but you may interpret it differently. I found the most effective, take me years to learn it, decades, is to approach these mysteries and challenges with an open heart. The challenge of our time is not lack of knowledge, it's not lack of statistics, it's not lack of money or well-written arguments, it's lack of loving in the public arena. And whatever role we play, our effectiveness improves when we fall in love with the issue, with its mystery, its brokenness, its contradictions. And without that love, only the insiders will stay. The rest will walk away, they'll move on to another program or another challenge, or they'll blame others and say, I wipe my hands of it. They'll get distracted by a search for more technology or techniques, or they'll think that no one else cares. So I think with an open heart, our job is to bring together the broken-hearted people who understand the challenges, the mysteries, is to bring them together with the brave-hearted and to rally the lovesick. And that is not just a mindset, it's an emotion set, or it's a heart set. And so that's where I am in terms of this issue of culture and how I approach it.
And so that's a strategy, if you would call it that, to see systems through the lens of feeling, in a way, that it's about feeling identity. They're sort of psychological constructs almost, that it's about wanting, it's about people being prepared to care about other people and issues. Let me bring in Jenny, who's been monitoring what's going on in our chat and the kinds of questions that have been coming up. Jenny.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So there's a lot of excitement on the Q&A at the moment from everything that everybody's been sharing and talking about. And I think people are really interested in the practicalities of doing this very, very deep work and what it is that you have been finding successful in that. So this may be a question to Diane, who you talked about the prototypes that you've been developing. And so we have a question here from Richard and also from Lewis about the kinds of approaches that you've been taking to help people to let go of what you might sort of see as systemic discrimination that's sort of sitting there. What are the kind of prototypes that you've tried, and what have you discovered from making those happen?
Well, again, just so everybody knows, we do have a website, Winnipeg Boulders Project, and our 12 prototypes are listed there, so you can read on as much as you want. And I think, Jenny, the way I'm feeling right now to answer that question is to go to what Al has said. You know, centering Indigenous wisdom in the prototyping, we have a lot of different knowledge systems, if I can use those words. And one of them is the 7 sacred teachings. And love is probably the biggest out of the 7. And so when Al says that, I'm like, yep, exactly. Why aren't we talking about love? So in our prototypes, we talk about how do we action out these 7 sacred teachings. And so we talk about love. We talk about medicine. I'm an Anishinaabe. We talk about medicine wheel teachings. Medicine wheel teachings have 4 aspects of being it. I mean, there's lots and lots of teachings within medicine wheel, but one of them is, you know, we focus on the emotional, we focus on the physical, we focus on the spiritual, as well as the intellectual. So back to that love thing, like, we're crying all the time. We are laughing all the time. We are getting mad about things and pounding the table all the time. Like, there's lots of emotion in our work, right? And because you can't just deal with, like, say Al says, you can't just be in your head and just think this is all about knowledge and what we know, you know, from that headspace. We have 7 natural ways of healing, right? And talking and sharing and sitting in circle is one of those natural ways of healing. So we center those kinds of teachings in the prototype development. So again, when we're trying to figure out, one of our prototypes is the granny's house, right? So, you know, how might we talk about love and courage and respect and truth, you know, when we're dealing with our families? I just had the privilege of sitting with a business out in Victoria, Anamiki. They're a B corporation. They have the 7 sacred values as their guiding principles to their whole company. So that's a business that does technology. And one of their main approaches is love. I love that. So there's lots of examples of how we, and Al, it's very concrete. That is very concrete to me.
Thank you, Diane. That was wonderful. And it speaks a lot to how much language shapes our understanding of even what's possible to be acknowledged in those situations. So touching on that, I have another question here from Nikitasha, who is interested in how both of you speak to systems, how you find a language to speak to systems in a less distant or unfamiliar way. So given the fact that what you're trying to do is to bring everybody to a collective understanding or a collective ownership of the fact that we need to make these culture shifts, how do you help people to see that they're part of that system and they can be part of shifting it? And maybe Al will go to you first on that one.
Thanks, Jenny. I think I'll rely on an adage that's been part of the disability movement for decades, which is nothing about us without us. And so the way to engage, in my opinion, with the system is to establish your own power base that is independently funded. So the convening, the connecting, the curating that is done to unify a movement is stabilized in the form of an apparatus that approaches the system as an equal. So it doesn't deposit a solution at a system and say, you know, do your best with it, and then is just rapidly there to criticize it. It says, we're going to take responsibility for the design and the support and the implementation and the media, et cetera, and engage in an equal power relationship. So you're not having to find out where the meeting is, who's on it, why it's not represented, whatever. It is possible for us as citizens to expand the notion of representative democracy and to build that kind of apparatus before we engage or simultaneous with engaging with the system. So I hope that helps in a way, Jenny, in terms of dealing with this question of power and purpose. Is we get to define in Nothing About Us Without Us what the language is, what the framework is. It's our decisions around problem or challenge. It's our decision around the solutions and how we go about doing it. Then we engage with the system.
So Al, that speaks almost directly to the last question that I'll bring into this conversation, which is from Peter Jan, who says, I've always believed that changing systems is most plausible from within, despite existing resistance and sometimes little buy-in. But how have you, as in your own work, you've both been, both insiders and outsiders at various different times, what position do you feel you've been more effective in? Thinking back to Al's point about you have to create a vehicle to approach the system with. Diane, I wonder if that's where you feel you've had most power, if you like.
Well, I think back to Imi's point about it's the and, it's not the either or, that we need people within, we need people without. So we need all the voices. That's, again, clan system teachings for Anishinaabe. It's like everyone has a role and everyone has a voice. So it's just recognizing that. So that's the first cut. I've mostly been outside of the dominant systems. So that's always been my role, is outside the dominant systems. But I've also been in Indigenous systems. And either way, and it's sort of back to that first question you just asked, Al, I go back to, it really is about centering relationships, and that I value this relationship. I don't value the point you're trying to make or the point I'm trying to make. I don't value that above this relationship. And as an example, I've been working with someone who is very much has a lot of power in the dominant systems. And we've been working together for about 15 years now. And I just got all upset and I went off and I was talking about white fragility and white privilege. And I was saying settlers, and I was saying, Columbus was the one who was lost. Indigenous people found him and his people and healed them. And Columbus wasn't even the first one here. The Vikings were here before him, right? But here's how history gets written. So I was going off saying all these things. I really offended him in saying all those things. And so, here come the 7 teachings at play. I needed to speak my honesty. So he knew that. And, we needed to have enough respect for each other. We needed to have enough humility that our egos didn't get in the way. And we had to have enough courage to have those difficult conversations, because I needed to say those things, even though it triggered him, set him off, it offended him, but we were able to then come back to it and say, okay, that's, okay, now how do we move forward? How might we work together in this city of Winnipeg, you and your circle of influence, me and my circle of influence, and how might we move forward together, right? So I think, again, we need enough space for what brings us together and how we're the same, but equally, we need to have a lot of space for how we're different and what diversity it is and how we embrace that diversity and use that diversity to move us forward even more. So one of your questions, earlier was about, how might we work with people in systems or something like that. I really fundamentally believe that it's got to be relationships, because even though there's policy that says one or two things, there's a lot of discretion in how we might implement policy, or at some point, somebody's now going to start writing down procedures and we can change that stuff, right? Or we have a lot of discretion in how we're interpreting that stuff. So lastly, Jenny, I'll say this whole idea, what I'm doing at Boldness right now is very much cross-sector work. I am in other audiences and circles that I have never been in before, and it's very odd places for me. I used to be only in circles that people look like me, they talk like me, they say the same things as me, we use the same words to mean the same thing, I am now in all of these different realms and sectors that are using these words that I'm like, oh, that's not what I mean by that word. So I feel like I'm translating all the time, but I go, okay, it's about the relationship. So Roussin, put your ego aside, don't get all annoyed about this, be patient, listen, try to understand, and try to be that bridge builder, because that's where I'm at in my life now. I used to be not at that place when I was younger, but so.
I think at that point, we're going to have to unfortunately bring it to a close. Imi, I'm cruel, but I'm going to give you a minute to respond to all of that discussion. So if you've got I'm going to cut you off after 60 seconds, because
you just start waving at me to cut me off.
I will.
Because I feel like we could talk about this all day. Look, I think I'm not going to repeat what Diane and Al have said, and Charlie, your sense making of this is just so brilliant. I agree with everything, and I think that to finish, what I want to say is there'll be a lot of the dominant system in this call, with power, with resources, and if it can be true that we need to think about the radical visions, and we need to give form to these ideas, and we need to think about now and the future. There's one sort of call to action I really want to say with those with dominant power, which is when this much organizing, when the black vote in America has done what it's done, when Georgia has moved how it has, and Stacey Abrams has registered 800,000 voters, when Diane and many like her have pioneered the work that they have, when Al has, you have to meet that halfway. You have to come to that and think about, how do we fund this bit now, as well as understand that, you know, if we want to move to 7 sacred values or other many different knowledge systems and values that can overlap and come together to take us through these really, really difficult challenges. What we can't do is sit back and say, well, we're the dominant system, we're really working hard to try and tell us everything, tell us, you know, you've got to meet that halfway today. And I have to say, I've experienced some of that, Charlie, with some of the work that you've supported us with, where the system and some funders are starting to meet halfway. But it's like, we can start doing that now, as well as everything else. And I want to finish off with that, which is, you've heard amazing things from incredible people who are making this their life's work, and who are not getting distracted and are falling in love with the complexity and the opportunity and the challenge and the pain, as Al said. But you have to meet that halfway if you have power and resource, and you sit within the existing system in a way, not just sit back and wait for answers. And so I want to say, I invite that and say thank you for today. It's been really incredible.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Al, for a discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer, and it's hard to sum up. But let me just leave you with a couple of thoughts. One is the importance of this sort of critical engagement with history, that systems are made by people over time. They face different choices. Actually, if you can open up the history, you can open up the future. The second is really about the nature of these discussions, about, I suppose, getting comfortable with having uncomfortable discussions might be a way of thinking about it, which requires an honesty and a language to do that. But one of the features, I think, of all of 3 of you is that you all in different ways create spaces where those conversations can start taking place, those and both spaces, where there can be honesty and passion and thought and reflection and empathy. And there's something about creating more of those spaces. I mean, if you go to Port Luke, where Imi is dealing with people from the local community and property developers and the council and so on and so forth. And it's like a sort of washing machine. And when Diane was describing her granny's house idea, that in its way is a one way of thinking about how these things come together and have a conversation about what they might do together. So definitely and both, not either or. So I'm just going to take a quick look at the graphic recording that Riley has done. As I said, we're going to send that to you tomorrow in an email to wrap up. And just to remind you that tomorrow, if you want to log in, we have a brilliant discussion picking up some of these themes about investing in systems change. That's going to be at 10 o'clock Central European time tomorrow. And we're going to have a session in the afternoon about scaling in principle and principles-based work, which echoes many of the ideas we've been talking about today. We are going to post in the chat a link to a Padlet, which is a bulletin board where you can log your questions and thoughts. Often you have these after the session is over. Tomorrow we'll send you a recording, a link to a recording of this entire session, as well as a blog that I'll write overnight trying to sum up some of the lessons. and we very much hope that you will stay in touch with us. And I want to thank again Al, Diane, and Imi for leading us into such a powerful and interesting discussion. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Helena Bililo, who is the chief of the interventions unit here at the Rockwell Foundation, and the person who has made all of this possible. Helena, to close us off.
Thank you, Charlie. Let me first of all just say heartfelt thanks to Al and Diane and Imi. It has been an absolutely amazing conversation to follow, and it's gone a very different direction than what I thought preparing for this. And then yet maybe not, but I think I have certainly learned a lot today, and most of all I've been thinking, how is it that we can be humble about the learning that we can get from alternative systems? There are so many rich systems and cultures and values out there, and there's something about lack of humility in the dominant system about reaching out to these systems. And then you moved on to talk about love. And we are trying basically to improve welfare systems. But a welfare system, welfare, the word itself, welfare, also in Danish, it almost translates literally, is about faring well. But there's no way that you can fare well. There's no way that you can thrive without love. So why is it, and I think this is the mystery of today, why is it that our welfare systems are completely, love is completely absent in them? That is the mystery question that I'll take home from today and think about how can we reinstall love in our welfare systems. Thank you all.
Thank you. And we'll see you again tomorrow, we hope.